Peter, we first met by telephone talking about Sam Phillips coming into the Leadership Studies program at Williams College to talk about him as a leader. Many others we've written about seem to me to be leaders in different ways. And I just wondered what you can tell us about Sam, about how he has shaped your conceptions of leadership, and some of the other people that have interest in you.
Well, you know, it's funny, when you called me, it was really with the idea of getting Sam to speak in that leadership series, and I might have been there as a kind of interlocutor or something.
Yes.
And to me, and you talked about, you had Red Auerbach, I think.
Yes.
And the interesting thing to me about that, I don't know that I've thought about other people other than Sam in a position as leader. I mean, for instance, somebody like Muddy Waters he was like a king. I mean, Howlin' Wolf was totally commanding. Solomon Burke was the king of rock and soul. But I wouldn't necessarily think of them as leaders. In Solomon's case, who I've never met anyone that I've loved more than someone in the world, but you might have called him a misleader, leader, in the best sense.
Yeah.
But Sam, the thing that had struck me when you called me about Sam, was that he would not be out of place. You could be talking about Hannibal, and you could be talking about Red Auerbach, you could be talking about generals, you could be talking about, and this was his self-conception, was as a leader. And the thing that was most extraordinary about my first meeting with him back in '79 was he was in '79, he was 56 years old, which I thought was really old.
It was once upon a time.
And I was 35, which I thought was old enough. Really, I definitely could stop right there. But I had been running this camp that my grandfather had started in '37. He had gotten sick in New Hampshire. He had gotten sick, and I had been running it since '70, so for almost 10 years ago. And the philosophy that Sam Phillips espoused was so close to everything that I'd ever striven for in terms of running the camp. The whole concept of enlisting people and self-belief. I mean, that was the essence of was selling people on themselves and at the same time maintaining control without maintaining such tight control that they would feel as if they were either threatened or they were being stunned. And that was what Sam, I mean, you could have, there's that saying, you couldn't knock me over with a feather. I've never used that expression before, and I don't know if it's appropriate. But the point was, I was so flabbergasted. I mean, I was so enthralled to Sam, not because of going into that interview. I mean, I had been trying to interview for almost 10 years at that point. He had done no interviews. He had never done an interview.
So he would just say no, or he wouldn't hear?
Well, I'd been friendly with his son, Knox Phillips. I had met Knox, I think, initially he wrote me a fan letter about something I wrote in Rolling Stone. Maybe when I feel like going home. My first book came out in '71. And then we met not long afterwards, and we became the best of friends. Knox was doing everything he could to persuade his father that to serve history, you have to advance yourself. And Sam just said, I don't have time for it. I'm not going to look back. I'm looking forward, which he did until the day he died. And when I finally interviewed him in '79, this was a triumph on Knox's part, finally getting his father to speak to someone. And Sam made a big point of the fact that this was the first interview he had ever done with anyone outside of Memphis or outside of the trade magazines. Now, I can tell you this is not, strictly speaking, true. This was Sam's conceit. It was a poetic conceit, but it was what he believed, and it was a big deal. And so I go in there, and I'm totally thrilled to meet somebody who had recorded Howlin' Wolf, who recorded B.B. King, who recorded Ike Turner, who recorded Rufus Thomas, Little Junior Parker, Johnny Cash Elvis, and Jerry Lee Lewis.
A giant.
Yeah. But what flabbergasted me, I mean, I would have been enthralled no matter what, but he started talking about much broader concepts of leadership. He started talking about psychology. He started talking about, and I know a lot of people would just maybe would, in later life, Sam, once he had done the interview with me, he was wide open. He did interviews with everybody, and I think a lot of people saw it as not entirely hot air, but a lot of hot air. But to me, he was speaking words of wisdom, and not let it be. He was just speaking. I mean, what he said just really hit home. And what I realized, I mean, I've now been working on this biography for 6 or 7 years, And I interviewed him many, many times, but I also spent a hell of a lot of time going out to dinner, which often were these two-fisted drinking dinners on his part, where he would have a glass of red wine in one hand, a glass of white wine in the other, and he'd never get around to eating. But the point was that he gave me, in a nutshell, in that 2 hours. I spent the whole day as part of a bucket brigade, the radio studio that flooded that day to see him in '79. And I'm carrying out what Knox wanted to reschedule, and I said, no, there's nothing I could do. And at the end of that day, we sat down, and maybe we talked to him for 2 hours that day, which is short of it by Sam's standards. But he gave me, in a nutshell, his philosophy of life. And it's something, at the time, I thought, well, I mean, I was totally knocked out. But I also thought, well, okay, that's what he said today. But that, he saw himself as a teacher, he saw himself as a leader, and it's just a lesson that he repeated in one form or another. Whether he was talking to the yard man or he was talking to the King of England, he was going to give them the same advice and the same philosophy.
The concept of empowerment is very interesting. It seems to me that he's supporting, empowering guys, providing some energy for them, but at the same time still steering them.
He's totally about empowerment. He's totally about giving people these untried, untested, unproven talents. These people who were so aggrieved in terms of, first, the African American artists that he was working with exclusively for years, seeing them as having been shunned aside by unjust, just by everything that was wrong about society, and being told that they didn't have a place. Everything he did was to say, you've got a place, not only have you got a place, you've got something to say. And they did. I mean, he's got something profound to say. But the interesting thing is, in terms of psychology, should appreciate this, is that this encouragement of others to express themselves, to find recesses within themselves that they hadn't previously suspected, also led to a distancing, so that he, in a certain sense, he recognized this. He saw this as a necessity, but he wanted people to have confidence in him, and he couldn't descend is the wrong word, but he couldn't embrace a kind of intimacy, social intimacy. This has nothing to do with black and white, and this is as true or even more true of the white artists that we later worked with. He had to be at a certain remove in order to be able
to empower them,
yes,
and let them fully reach within themselves.
Right. And so this too was a very conscious thing, and to some extent it may have worked against him with hurt feelings when Johnny Cash left him in '58, having told Sam the only lie that either of them could remember Johnny Cash ever uttered, saying that he wasn't leaving, saying it straight out. But when he left, it was as much a matter of hurt feelings as it was anything else. Because Sam's affections had transferred to Jerry Lee Lewis.
That is fascinating that he had sour relationships with, or the relationships did turn sour with Johnny Cash.
They didn't turn. I mean, he remained best of friends with. I mean, he remained supportive of Johnny Cash to the end of each of their lives. They died around the same time, and at every moment of crisis, he was there for Johnny Cash. I mean, when Johnny Cash was arrested for bringing back pills from Juarez, Sam was on the phone with him. I don't know how. Within, and I've got all this correspondence between him and Johnny Cash. Has spoken so eloquently. He said it was like Camelot being the son. But at the same time, from Johnny Cash's perspective, in order to grow, he had to leave. From Sam's perspective, he never achieved, and he never fully expressed himself to the degree that he had in Son. And you can see both points of view. And it took Johnny Cash a long time before he got the kind of encouragement or external insight that permitted him to do his best work after he went to Columbia.
And isn't it true of Elvis too that he really expressed himself more fully at Sun than he did later on?
Well, to a degree, I think. I mean, the recordings he made at Sun were such a sort of pristine beauty, such a classical form, and arrived at with such difficulty, achieving such kind of grace and lightness. I mean, almost as if they had just been tossed off, spontaneously. And yet the product of so much work, and of it's that Michelangelo thing, of finding a form in the model. But Sam, I think, felt that Elvis, he was appalled, for example, by Heartbreak Hotel. He said it was a morbid mess. And I always liked what Heartbreak Hotel, so
I liked it.
But what's interesting is that RCA had no idea what to do with Elvis after they signed it. And Steve Scholz, who sounds like he was a really good guy, was not any kind of producer or A&R, or maybe he was an A&R, but just had to do with it. And it wasn't until Elvis took control. I believe that this is what Sam told Elvis. I mean, you can say it's after the fact, but I think this is what he told him, because it's constantly what he ever said or believed. He told Elvis, don't let them turn you into something you're not. You express yourself exactly as you have here with what's inside of you. And with the session, only 6 months after Elvis signed with RCA, in July 2nd, 56, which produced both Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel, Elvis took total charge of the session. Nothing to do with Steve Scholz, and nobody had, this was not the case. And Sam, when he heard Don't Be Cruel, said, that's it. He's found his own voice. It's not what Sam would have done this. It was a different kind. It was a happy beat or a happy sad song or something. But Sam felt like he had found the means to express himself. And, now, as far as the movies went, Sam deplored that. And but I think that but Elvis, in the years after in the initial years after he left Sun, and even in those initial years after he came back from the Army, producing an extraordinary body of work, which isn't often appreciated for what it is, because people just see a mishmash, and often they love it all or they don't love it all.
Let me talk about Steve Scholz for just a second.
Yeah.
I love the way you talk about him. And we thought he got the wrong hillbilly after
Right, after
Carl
Carl
Perkins
Perkins, yeah.
did Most Great Shoes. Was he a bit of a visionary?
No.
I mean, he must have seen something.
No. I think Steve Scholz reacted to the field reports, to the, I talked to a number of the people who were seeing this phenomenon taking place. They brought it to him. He fought for Elvis, it's true, but there was another guy, whose name I'm going to forget now, vice president
At RCA.
who was actually more instrumental in signing Elvis. And I don't think it was any more visionary, but visionary is, often is hearing the sound of a cash register. And it is visionary sometimes but I mean, for example, if you're looking for a visionary in business, Alan Klein, who's the most reviled man in the history of music, he was far more visionary, or Colonel Parker, for that matter. Now, they were visionaries in terms of business, not in terms of art, but they were genuine visionaries in that way, and I don't think either one of them has ever gotten the credit for it. Sam Cooke was a visionary.
Sam Phillips' visions and leadership. I mean, the familiar story is that he wanted to hold together black music and white music. Did the vision go beyond that? I mean, did he see himself as what I think he was a transformative figure in society?
Totally. No, he had.
So he was aware of that at the very highest level.
Absolutely. No, I mean, and the thing is, again, many people will dispute this, and I'm sure when my book comes out, people will say, oh, this is all just, after the fact. But in fact, there are expressions of this from the very first on Sam's part. I mean, there's an article in the press center of the Commercial Appeal when Ike Turner and the Kings of Rhythm, it was actually Jackie Princeton, Delta Cast, either one. When Rocket 88 was just beginning to take off, and
This is 51.
51, and they appeared at the W.C. Handy Theater in Orange Mound, Memphis. And Sam inveigled somehow this reporter who knew nothing about the music to come out and hear them. And so you've got this weird report from this white reporter whose beat wasn't even music, about this thing taking place. But Sam's quotes in there, while they're truncated, see a day when this would be pop music. Rocket 88 would be accepted by whites as much as blacks. And he was aiming for that with B.B. King. He was aiming for that with Howlin' Wolf. It wasn't a question of, it was a question of really of an integrated audience. And it was a question of how do you get that integrated audience? The only way you can get it is when you integrate society in some form. The music was the form in which he was going to do it. Now, he never, as he said, I never got on top of any I never stood on top of any tall stumps and proclaimed this message.
Right.
Because,
But that was his vision.
But that was his vision, and the white participation was very much an accommodation to the recognition that he couldn't sell more than 50,000 copies of a record in 1975. He could have a #1 R&B hit, and he had them. He had it with Bearcat, with Rufus Thomas. He had it with Junior Parker. I mean, I don't know if they were #1, but they were up there. He had it with Ike Turner. He had it with Howlin' Wolf. But he couldn't get beyond. It was really the color barrier. And he had. This was part of his vision. Was he finally, or what he finally came to the realization was without a plausible white messenger, without finding a white man who could sing like a Negro, but far more important, have the Negro feel, have that uninhibited exuberance, that he, of John Lee Hooker, of Lightning Hopkins, of Howlin' Wolf, and be doing it not as an imitator, but from his or her own experiences and his or her own feelings. And once the mass audience, which is the white audience, see, now this is my whole speech, but once the mass audience was exposed to that, they would never be able to turn away from it. And that would open up the doors for all the great black performers to walk in through, not stigmatized as race artists, not stigmatized as blues, but as pop artists, and that's exactly what happened.
Did he see changes in society on race opening up the opportunity for music to cross race lines, or did he see the music
No, he saw
changing society?
He saw the music changes. He also saw, for instance, I spoke to one member of his family who told me about how when Martin Luther King spoke at the March on Washington, Sam insisted that everybody, including people who were not raised in his family, who were not particularly sympathetic, that they watched this and telling them this was the most significant event that they were ever going to witness in their lives. And, this was not the background that he came from, but it was what he espoused. So, he saw it as part and parcel of the same thing, but he was not, there was no one marching in the streets when he started with music, and he was marching in the streets simply by recording the music at a time when nobody else was going to do it, by, when he was going to work, just during the scorn and contumely of everybody working and eventually losing his job. Not for that reason exactly, but somewhat. But essentially being just dismissed as a joke at best for hanging around with these black people.
Dewey Phillips, is he a revolutionary character as well?
Well, Sam would say he was revolutionary. He was revolutionary by instinct, and he
not
was
by intellectual design.
He was revolutionary by his embrace of everything from Frank Sinatra to Swan Silvertones, by espousing what he espoused without regard to race, creed, and color, and particularly color. And so his show was
Red Hot Blue.
That was revolutionary in and of itself, and drew an audience. Started out with an audience that was exclusively black. Drew an audience which was at least as much white as it was black, and becoming sort of sitting byword and having, when Dewey, Memphis, I think, still has an anti-boys ordinance. You can't blow your horn, you're fine.
Oh, that's right, people were blowing horns.
And Dewey's announcing how good people. He says, now Chief McDonald got upset about all that horn blowing last night. Now let me just tell you something. I'm going to tell you, I don't want you blowing those horns, particularly I don't want you blowing those horns at 11:03 p.m. tonight. Everybody will hear.
Oh, that's great. One of the things that came out in the A&E film on Sam with the Richmond was some black artists felt that Sam deserted them, and
I think
there seemed to be some hard feeling there.
I think the main person was Rufus Thomas. I think that was the one person we had. That's the one person I've heard of. There is nobody. I said this about Solomon Kirk. I would say it also about Rufus. There's nobody I've enjoyed spending time with, loved more than Rufus Thomas. But this was Rufus's MO in general. If you ask Rufus about Stax, he would name people who had, who had scorned him, who had treated him in a way that he shouldn't, and they were as likely to be black as white. The peculiar thing with Rufus is that he actually made quite a bit of money. He was a son by parents, so it's like several $1,000s at a time when that meant something. He didn't re-sign with Sam. He left Sun long before Elvis Presley ever came into the picture.
Right.
And he signed with a company, or he indicated his intent to go with a company called Star Maker, which WDIA, which was the first black radio station in the country, all black, all staff. And and they were going to start a label called Star Maker. Rufus left Sun to go to that, which never really got off the ground. So it's a weird kind of recasting of history. Sam would say that it was one of the greatest regrets of his life that he didn't continue to record more African American artists. He continued to record some, but not many. Roscoe Gordon continued to record. He did a blues album with Frank Frost years later, and that remained where his heart was. But he said it was but he was a one-man operation in a studio that was dimensions I don't quite remember. Tiny
So wonderful room.
Yeah, a tiny storefront studio. But he was the person who did everything. He was, he recorded the music, he promoted the music, he sold the music, he did. And Marion Keisker, who worked with him at the beginning, was, an admirable assistant, a brilliant woman, a wonderful person. But as she herself would be the first to say, it was all in service for Sam. It was not.
Well, she was in love with Sam, wasn't she?
She was totally. Yeah. And so he would agree with the fact that it was to his eternal regret that he abandoned recording black music for the most part. But his larger point was he didn't have regrets about the results because there were all these labels like Chess, like Modern, like new more and more labels springing up that were recording rhythm and blues and doing a good job at it. And he had the opportunity not just to make money, but also to make this breakthrough, which helped create this music that came to be called rock and roll, which offered the opportunity for all these great black artists that had simply hadn't been consigned to one little place. But Rufus would be here, and Rufus would be vociferously disagreeing.
Anecdote about Marion Keisker. Is it true somehow this is filtered into my mind as part of the narrative? I mean, did she at some critical point when Scotty Moore and Bill Black were looking for say something like, "What about the kid with the sideburns?"
She said that, and I think that that's a very plausible thing. Sam, if you would vociferously object to that. Yeah. but the point was that she was, I think, Elvis's staunchest advocate.
Right from the beginning, when she first saw him, or after
he
hung around for a while?
There's a great dispute. There was a great dispute between Sam and Marion about who recorded the personal record, the acetate that he first made.
My Happiness.
That's when your heartaches begin, My Happiness. And in the end, much as I loved Marion, I wrote a long back note on this last train to Memphis about why I thought it was Sam, because I never... It just could be wrong too. But the only 2 or 3 people would know for sure. But it wasn't a matter of any great importance. It was a kid walking in off the street wanting to make a record. But I've never found anybody else than Marion recorded in all the time that I was. And also, Marion frequently said memory was a function of the imagination, and she had a terrible memory. She said that. And her story about what happened that day varied a good deal from time to time, none of which takes anything away from her as a person. And Sam was very ungentlemanly in his, he didn't become aware that she had said this until 1979, and he just hit the roof. But I remember that. And so they had a considerable dispute, although they remained somewhat friendly. But the thing is that once he had made that first acid tape, Elvis came back. This was in the summer of '53. He came back in January '54, made a second, which Marion, perhaps very gentlemanly, ladylike way, says, well, Sam made that, but Sam says there never was a second. So this is a. But the point is that Elvis stopped by all the time.
Yeah.
It was always, and the person that he would see every time he stopped by was Marion, and Marion was entranced by Elvis. I mean, not in love with him as she was with Sam, but in love with him.
Because of his personality, his voice, the whole package.
No, I don't think it had anything to do with his voice. He was just such a wonderful kid, and he had that knack that some people have for putting himself forward by hanging back. And so, he brought out, he was a motherly instinct. Some women might say he brought out the beast in them. But the point is, he drew people towards him, and he drew women. But Marion just was enormously fond of him, and that was his touchstone. He wasn't coming in to see Sam. Sam wasn't out front, and so this was before he was driving his Crown Electric truck. He was working for, I forget who, but he stopped by.
How old was Marion? Elvis was 19.
Marion was a little older than Sam. Marion must have been born around 1916 or so, I guess. So she would have been in her 40s, late 30s. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And so but she was just all for Elvis, and so I believe that. I mean, that's Scotty remembers it that way, and there's never been a more truthful person than Scotty and Marion. Sam always told me, he says, whatever Scotty tells you, you can take to the bank. He's the most truthful person I know. And if he contradicts me, believe Scotty. I don't know. Again, if Sam were here, he'd be coming in right now and he'd be saying, "I never said that." No, he wouldn't say that because I didn't mean you to carry it that far.
Well, Scotty's truthfulness, I love on the A&E tape where Steve Allen says that about that Elvis singing down, right?
Yeah.
He loved it, and Scott says he hated it.
Yeah.
But just back to leadership for a moment. I mean, it really is interesting to I think of Sam as a leader in the same category as many of the other great leaders that you mentioned, Hannibal or whoever it is. A combination of vision, getting people to follow by empowering them, making them independent, but still guiding them.
Well, and having a vision of your own, into which you're not trying to subsume the other person's vision, but which is basically it's the vision out front, which is leading everyone.
And James McGregor Burns' concept of transforming leadership with leaders and followers together raise themselves to higher levels of motivation and morality, and then the followers become leaders too, because they're jointly in this.
Okay, I need that for my talk tonight.
Enterprise, and just to think about Sam and the way he ties into some crucial concepts of leadership, especially Burns' transforming leader concept, which is one of the drums we beat most often here.
Well, you got to send me some,
I will. So, thank you very much. This has been terrific.
Well, thank you. That's great.